Now we're going to look at the remaining wars, or global wars of the 20th and 21st century, beginning with the Cold War. Cold War begins at the end of World War II between the Soviet Union, Communist Soviet Union, and the Democratic United States and its allies. Lasts between 1945 and 1991. So the end of World War II until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. If you take a look on your note sheet, you will see another page or another section for crash course video, which you will also find on the playlist. Just take time, watch that, answer the questions. Causes of the Cold War, systems of government. Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship. United States was a democratic republic. Two don't like each other, don't go together. The Soviet Union was trying to gobble up as many countries as they can and put them under the influence of communists. The United States and its allies were trying to contain this or keep this from keep the Soviet Union from going out and taking over too many countries. Their policy known as containment. Post-war conflict. Soviet Union and the United States disagreed over Eastern Europe. From the first video, the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin wanted a buffer zone to help prevent from attack from other countries. The United States did not agree with this. However, the Soviet Union was granted control over these Eastern European countries, and so the Soviet Union established communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. The United States resisted Soviet expansion and aided countries seeking to resist communism and their policy of containment. So wherever the Soviet Union was trying to go and take over and influence them into being communist, the United States would try and keep that from happening. The effects. Militarily, we have an arms race or a weapons race between the Soviet Union and the United States. This led to the threat of nuclear war. So both countries had nuclear weapons, and basically they used these weapons to scare the other into not doing anything dangerous. Confrontations took place around the world, including Germany and Berlin, Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Korea, the Korean War, as well as many other countries. Germany, we have the Berlin Wall. Okay, Berlin was divided between the Soviets and the Allies. Okay, so this is where we have East and West Berlin. Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets were trying to put missiles on Cuba, which would then be able to hit the United States and United States cities. Korea, we have the Korean War. Okay, we have the communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union. Democratic South Korea, backed by the United States. And so North Korea tries to invade South Korea and unite the Korean Peninsula. The United States goes in and prevents this from happening. This is where we have now. This is why we still have divided North and South Korea. North Korea, again, being communist, South Korea being democratic. We'll see this happen again in Vietnam as well, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Politically, the Soviet Union and the United States formed a variety of alliances. The United States formed NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Soviet Union organized the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed, and the United States became the world's sole superpower. That's why we don't have the Soviet Union today. We have Russia instead. So we see we have the Cold War, the solid line right here, representing the Iron Curtain, red, Western Bloc. Okay. The communist areas, democratic areas. Around the world, okay, the communist areas are in red, democratic areas are in blue, the gray areas are neutral. Vietnam War, fought between 1954 and 1975. Causes. French colonial rule of Vietnam ended in 1954 after the Viet Minh fought for Vietnamese independence. Basically, Vietnam thought they were going to get independence from being a colony of France after World War II. The French went back, left Vietnam, went back to France trying to protect it from German invasion. But after the war, French came back and they were recolonized Vietnam. This did not please their leaders, Ho Chi Minh being one of them. Basically, Ho Chi Minh went and tried to plead to the allies and their leaders, saying, allow us to be our own country and have our own country and our own government and leaders. But the democratic leaders of the Allies did not allow this to happen because, again, that imperialistic mindset was still there. They saw Vietnam as a area for good resources, and so they recolonized Vietnam. And so this caused Ho Chi Minh to turn to communism. And so we see the Western powers do not want communism spreading. Okay, and so in the north you have the communist north backed by the Soviet Union, democratic south backed by the United States. Communists go in trying to unite Vietnam. It was solely a civil war between North and South Vietnam, but because of their policy of containment, the United States sends in troops to aid South Vietnam to keep communism from spreading. And so this is how the Vietnam War starts. The United States thought it was going to take a very short time period to push back the North and help South Vietnam, but it turns into a very long war that did not have a lot of political or public support in the latter years in the United States. So we see our effects. U.S. reaches a peace agreement with North Vietnam and withdraws its troops in 1973. 2 years later, the North Vietnamese come in and they take over Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, and in 1976, Vietnam is unified and becomes a communist country. Some political cartoons for the Vietnam War. Persian Gulf War of 1990 and 91 causes. Iraq accuses Kuwait of stealing oil from an Iraqi oil field. Iraq invades Kuwait. Because of this, the United Nations passes economic sanctions on Iraq. Iraq ignores them, and so the United States leads a coalition into the Persian Gulf and starts the Persian Gulf War. The effects. Iraqi invasion threatened oil supplies produced by Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and so this is one of the main reasons as to why we go in. Continued economic sanctions by the UN on Iraq required the destruction of Iraq's chemical and biological weapons that they had used on their own people, but Saddam Hussein, who was the leader at the time, remained in power. This is a political cartoon of the Persian Gulf. You can see the countries of the Persian Gulf formed into the mouth of an alligator or a crocodile. Persian Gulf, you see the United States destroyer and an oil rig. You see these teeth look like rockets, meaning it's a very hostile area. Iraq War 2011-2003, or 2003 to 2011. Causes: September 11th attacks on the World Trade Centers. U.S. leaders believe Saddam Hussein, leader of Iraq, possesses a great threat to United States security, even though he had nothing to do with September 11th. Believe that Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, who he would then sell to terrorists. So the United Nations sends in their inspectors to search for these weapons of mass destruction, but none are found. So even though none are found, the United States still leads a coalition, and they invade Iraq to take Saddam Hussein out of power, despite there being no weapons of mass destruction found. Some political cartoons of the time. Effects of the war. Economic, the United States spent $3 trillion. As you can see, all the zeros, that's a lot of money on the war. In 2003, the price of a barrel of oil was $25, and 5 years later, in 2008, it was $140, which directly relates to the increase in gas prices. This is the first time in American history that a war was funded by debt or borrowing. So in other words, taxpayers were not required to pay for this war. And instead, the United States borrowed money to pay for the war. So they borrowed money and cut taxes at the same time. The United States debt in 2003 was $6.4 trillion. 5 years later, it was $10 trillion, hurting the United States economy while the Chinese economy boomed. Balance of power in the Middle East shifted. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a balancer against Iran and its allies. With no Saddam Hussein nor a strong Iraqi government, Iran and its allies assert their own agendas in the Middle East. The United States also loses respect of foreign countries. A Time magazine poll just before the war said that 84% of Europeans identified the United States as the main threat to world peace. Here's some more political cartoons. And that is our screencast video of the 20th and 21st century global wars.